Okay, I'm going to talk for a short while about navigating consular roadblocks. So remember that an approval by USCIS is only permission to remain in the United States until the end date on the I-94, but it's not permission to travel outside of the US and get back into the United States. That permission is only granted by the US State Department. So this whole system gets pretty confusing. There is an exception for Canadians who actually, in fact, in most cases can come back in just on the I-94. And business visitors, which Bob talked about, who come from visa waiver countries, there's a certain number of countries on a list, they can come in and fill out the forms on the plane, just the same way that we can go to, the UK or many other countries, but not China or India or many other countries. We have to get visas as well. So for work permits, however, any kind of work category, there is the visa requirement, except for Canadians. So, for example, once a student gets an H-1B and departs the U.S., that person has to get a visa to get back in, and that's only granted by making an appointment at the consulate abroad, typically in that person's home country. So, this is more and more an issue for employers and individuals traveling. And Deborah mentioned a little bit of this in her panel already, but I'm going to go into it just in a little bit more detail. And so our obstacles are that we have bigger delays than we've ever seen. Now, I just feel like this is such an uncheerful presentation overall. I don't want you guys to just feel super depressed because we're just bringing up thing after thing after thing. And truly, at this meeting of lawyers that I was just at, what we were talking about is how to stay buoyed, how to stay, enthusiastic about what it is we do when we're faced with all these obstacles. I think there are ways, to sort of know we're all in this together and it's not going to last forever and all of that. But, one thing that we're seeing is employers getting together, and we're going to talk about litigation at the end. I'm not going to detour my whole conversation, but, we do need to kind of get together and figure out solutions. But delays. Delays are caused for a variety of reasons, but there's also a shrinking of consular staff in many of these consulates abroad. I don't know if you guys have read about that, but people are leaving, people are being fired, and there's actually just not a lot of clear direction in the State Department. And so that is causing delays for foreign nationals making visa appointments. And many of these other roadblocks below on this list are also causing delays. Deborah mentioned extreme vetting in this context, but in many other contexts you've heard about it. This is a policy across the board. And what it means is each new visa applicant is regarded with a certain amount of suspicion. Actually, the woman who helped put together this whole conference today mentioned to me that she just flew back from Hong Kong and as a tourist. And before she got on the plane, all of the people in line on the plane were being asked questions by, was probably airline people in advance of coming back, but she had to answer questions like where she works, what her job is, she's a U.S. citizen, by the way. And she said, well, I just came here as a tourist. Doesn't matter. There is just an extreme vetting policy happening where, as U.S. citizens traveling abroad, you're going to notice that you're getting asked questions on both sides. So this extreme vetting policy is definitely clearly in place, and it obviously takes more time for each applicant to make a request or to have an interview to get the visa, so it's causing the delays. The other thing is there are mandatory interviews for visa applicants. Now, that was the case, that was initiated quite a while ago, but then a number of consulates started to develop policies of being able to have seasoned travelers, people with regular H-1B visa renewals and so forth, drop their passports off, or business visitors drop their passports off and pick them up later. They would just check the database, make sure they haven't turned into terrorists or anything like that. But with the new administration, face-to-face interviews are mandated across the board with very few exceptions, and this is also dragging out the process and delaying travel. Now, depending on the country, this can really cause major issues. For example, we don't have reciprocity with certain countries on certain kinds of visas. Chinese nationals, for example, on an O1, the extraordinary ability, let's say the extraordinary ability business visitor, might only get a 3-month visa with a single entry. They're not going to be given multiple entry visas for the duration of the O1 for the full 3 years. So if you have someone in that position, the O1 is actually maybe not that helpful. We've gotten green cards for people who really don't want green cards in the extraordinary ability category, who qualify as O1s just because they don't want to have to go back and get a visa every single time they want to travel back into the U.S. So these mandatory interviews are daunting. The change in the standards of review. Now, Deborah mentioned that as well in this context, but if there is a new policy and we don't have the deference for the H-1B, for example, maybe the person hasn't applied for an extension yet, but needs to go abroad and get the visa for business travel or whatever. It's possible that that application is going to be reviewed under these new standards, and that individual gets stuck abroad. The out-and-out ban for certain nationals from certain countries, of course, is causing issues for people already here who are on maybe an H-1B, whatever it is they're on, that want to go home for personal reasons. Think about it. Family illnesses, parents are dying. We've seen clients in the past who have on their own, grounded themselves in the United States, even with H-1Bs, because they're afraid to go back. And maybe they won't get back again, especially with the ban. Administrative processing is, Deborah mentioned it as well. This is when a consulate really can't make the decision and sends the inquiry to the State Department to review the application. Well, that sounds fine if the State Department would actually do that rather quickly. But for example, we have a client on an O1, got the O1 approval, went back to Iran, where he's from. The ban was on again, off again, on again, off again. When it's off, we've been able to send him through to a consulate to be reviewed. He really has been back and forth to the U.S. many times on a business visitor visa. So there really is no reason to put him into administrative processing. They did that, and it has been a year and a half. So administrative processing is a black hole. We have a really hard time doing anything about it. Nobody will give us information typically when something is in administrative processing. It might be a good moment to bring a congressional representative into the case, perhaps, but even then, certain administrative cases, the government will just say, it's highly confidential, we're not going to give you any information, and so we're not going to really find out why it is that this person isn't getting back here. So what are the solutions? obviously, plan ahead, This is always critical, but it's more important now than it has ever been before. And you should make sure that your employees are aware of the importance of planning ahead as well. Maybe you have employees that are going for personal reasons and you don't really know that someone is traveling. But especially those who come from kind of difficult, highly backlogged areas. India, we really do expect China to become more backlogged in the future. Certainly employees that are, subject to the ban. We think it's probably, not probably, we think it's a good idea to implement a policy with all foreign national employees that they check in with you to ensure that their visas are in order before they travel, whether it's for personal or business reasons. You may want to make sure that the business unit managers understand this before organizing travel for an individual that might be a key person to travel to China for some sort of important business reason. But make sure that people understand these things who are working for you or working in your companies, because you don't want to end up with a key employee going abroad and not being able to get back. Consider in your policies that you might want to restrict travel for people from certain countries, which sounds harsh. I mean, obviously, they're free agents, and if they have to go back because a parent is dying or whatever, a wedding or, something, but still, make sure that they understand the consequences, because they may not fully really be aware. I just heard recently that China may be on the list as a country that they're going to really start being much more restrictive with visas. Maybe that won't be the case with H-1Bs, but certainly student visas. Bob and I remember a time when Chinese nationals couldn't come to the U.S. very, very often on F-1 visas, particularly with family members, but often, it was really tough to get an F-1 student visa. And so they would come on J-1s as J-1 scholars, particularly in advanced programs. But as I think Deborah said, that they're subject to the 2-year foreign residence requirement. So after that point, they'd either have to figure out how to get a J waiver, which is not necessarily easy, requires a lawyer, or go back and wait for 2 years before ever being eligible for an employment visa. And finally, third country visa review. And that isn't always possible, but in certain instances, it may be possible to get visas in Canada or some other third country for a Chinese national. If someone goes to a U.S. consulate in Canada and is basically denied a visa, it may be possible, instead of getting a denial, to withdraw the application and get that person back in the U.S. under a policy that allows a 30-day departure only to Canada, I think also Mexico maybe, but very few people go to Mexico for these third country visa reviews. To come back in if it's 30 days on the basis of their existing I-94 card, for example, an H-1B. There are, believe it or not, there's lawyers who specialize in just, really taking people across the border, and they keep track of where the most lenient officers are, and they move around. So, it sounds, I'm looking at some sort of incredulous faces here, but, like one moment Nova Scotia is the place to go, and the next moment Vancouver is the place to go. So everybody just kind of races to the consulate that might be the most lenient, as absurd as that sounds, and it's really not quite as possible today. Thank you very much.